Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking empathic leadership with Dr. Peter Sear. Peter, great to have you on.
Hi Dan, I'm really delighted to be here.
Super excited to talk to you about leadership, empathic leadership, something that I know you're passionate about. You're well versed in, you have a PhD in this area and you work on this with leaders every single day. And you've recently released a book as well, which we're going to unpack. Before we do that, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I didn't go straight into university from school. I was actually a futures floor trader for a few years. I got kind of sick of education by the time I got to sort of 17.
Okay.
And I went into the city and did that for a few years. And it was a very exciting environment. I really enjoyed it. But after 2 or 3 years, I just began to see it as numbers on a board and a lot of shouting, and the novelty had worn off somewhat. And I noticed that whenever I had the chance to do a course or anything or extra learning in that area, I jumped at it and enjoyed just gathering more information. And I realised that a couple of years after school, I really missed learning. So I was fortunate enough to get made redundant. I say that because I might never have left because the money was good. And I went travelling with the redundancy money, and while I was travelling, decided that I was going to go to university when I got back. The first A-level I studied evenings was psychology, and it just grabbed me. I just thought, this is something I'm passionate about. I used to get home from classes and talk to my family and friends about what I'd learned and tell them stories about, famous studies and things. And I was just self-aware enough to realise that this was my subject. And one day they were handing out forms for university, and I thought, well, yeah, that's got to be it. So I did that. The University of Hertfordshire said if you get a B because you're a mature student, you can go along and do a degree in it, and I got that. And the University of Hertfordshire was a great psychology department at the time. It was really good. And I actually wanted to do what you did, the sports psychology route, straight away. And I discussed this through my degree with different members of staff, but this was... So I did my degree between 94 and 97, which I'd imagine before you, is that?
Only fractionally, a couple of years.
Yeah, right. But that couple of years might have made a lot of difference. I don't know, or maybe I just got bad advice. But the staff that I spoke to about doing sports psychology after my degree sort of advised me against it. They said, "Look, this is a very young subject, really. There were only a couple of books out about it that I'd read and thought, well, yeah, I could get into this, but there were a limited number of theories and practices, and the general consensus from people I spoke to then was, how much is there in this? How much are you going to get a career out of this?" And as you say, a couple of years later might have made all the difference, but instead, I decided to do a master's in industrial relations and human resource management because I thought, I was still thinking of sport, actually. I thought, well, every sports club has a human resources department.
Clever.
So that gives me an opportunity to go and work anywhere and do whatever I want. The trouble is when I did that master's, I didn't really enjoy the human resources subject that much. So I managed to do my dissertation on the Bosman ruling.
Oh,
so that kept football involved there because that had just happened, and obviously player power and athlete power was changing, so that was of interest. During that time, as a family, with my parents and my siblings, we started a property business, and I sort of agreed to go into that and commit to that while they got it going. But while I was still doing that master's degree, and the business went so well that I couldn't get away from it. The money was good and it was doing well. So I just continued to study psychology, philosophy, things like that in my spare time. And I did another part-time master's degree in post-Jungian studies, which is more of a depth psychology perspective at the Centre for Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. And that, I'd sort of touched on Jung in my reading before, but Jung sort of umbrellaed all the things that I was interested in: philosophy, myth, religion, the subconscious. So it was a really fantastic course, and I met some excellent people doing that. Then I thought about becoming a psychotherapist, which is a sort of natural progression from studying Jung, I suppose. And to do that, you have to go into therapy yourself. And obviously, that was a really fascinating process. I did a few years seeing a Jungian analyst and got my hours up to apply. The more I considered it, the more I worried that the work might be really emotionally draining. And I was thinking about starting well, we just had our first child at the time, and other psychologists, psychotherapists were talking to me about not having the emotional energy when they got home from their work for their family. And that concerned me a little bit. And I just wondered if I could think of ways of using my learning in a more positive way. So in spaces like workspaces, perhaps, where you stop people from getting into psychological problems before they get there, rather than fight the fire of helping them solve the problem. So I looked around for different ideas for PhD, and I'd done some neuroscience work. I did a neuroscience correspondence course for the University of Chicago, and then I studied a cross between psychoanalysis and neuroscience, which is called neuropsychoanalysis at the Tavistock, which was fascinating.
Wow.
And of all these directions of psychology that I'd come from, the thing that stood out for me was emotions, because, ultimately they drive our behavior and our intentions. And I was fascinated about how that worked, and I read a lot about emotions and everything. But then I sort of stumbled on the area of empathy and thought, well, that is the key area, because empathy is understanding the emotions of others. And if we understand the emotions and intentions and perspectives of others, then we can understand their behavior. And I was always somebody who wanted to explain behavior. Like when I had mates who went off the rails or whatever, or did stupid things, I'd really scratch my head and think, well, why did they do that? What's happened to them to get them to that point, And I really wanted to understand their perspective. I'd also played a lot of football growing up. I just spent my whole life playing football. I was with Watford Youth in my teens, and played for my county and things. And I was often made the captain of sports teams throughout school from very young. And sometimes it was a different sport, and I wasn't always the best player. And I wondered what people saw in me that made them choose me as an on-the-field captain. And I think that came back to me always wanting to understand people, maybe listen to people, or understand that people need to be treated differently. And those sort of thoughts were the sort of incubation of my idea of applying empathy to sport leadership. So I took the idea to Professor James Skinner at Loughborough University, London, and he loved it. He said, look, there's no one else has done this. We've studied leadership in all sorts of different ways, but nobody's done this. And everybody told me, if you do a PhD, you have to get together all your interests, because you're doing this for a long time. It's going to drive you mad. And I thought, well, I've got psychology. I've got the psychology I'm most interested in, the emotions and the empathy and behaviour. And I've got sport. So this should keep me focused. And unfortunately enough, it did.
And so you set off on a journey of a PhD.
Yeah, so I started that in 2017 in January. I met at Loughborough the November before, and they said you can start when you want. So I started in January. It took me a little bit longer because of COVID, so I finished in July 21. So it was about just over 4 years. And during that time, obviously, you know yourself at Loughborough University, you meet so many interesting people in sport. There's so many opportunities to go to events and things where you just bump into people you can hardly believe you're bumping into. It's fantastic. I managed to get fantastic subjects for my research. I interviewed 20 head coaches of elite sports teams around the world. So that's all. That was, I think it was 11 at international level, 9 at top national level.
Okay.
In 9 different sports: cricket, football, handball, hockey, ice hockey, lacrosse, netball, rugby union, volleyball. 8 different nationalities, working in 11 different countries, but often with the experience of working in a variety of countries around the world as well. So I had a lot of interest in time spent with them and interviewing them and hearing their stories about how they think empathy is integrated into their work and how they use it as a tool and how important it is to them, and often comparing it with how things were when they were athletes themselves and how they were coached and how they think things have changed. Um, at Loughborough as well, I also attended some of those, the Foundation for Leadership Through Sport workshops as well that were fantastic. You meet a lot of people from sport and the military and business as well.
Mm.
I heard you speaking to Richard Nugent the other day about
Yep.
the crossover between things, and that was another reason that I wanted to look at empathic leadership in elite sport, because I think it's such a great test ground for any other industry because of the high performance and high competition. But it's also something that's very transparent sport. So it's something that's analysed in the media. It's something like we talk about with our friends. So it's like a common ground, if you like, for people from different industries to say, "Oh, look, have you seen what's happening there?" You know, it's most people have heard of Jurgen Klopp, whether they're into football or not. You know, so it just seemed right to focus on sport more than anything else.
And so often on the Sports Site Show, we unpack research papers, and you've done your PhD, and I suppose we could have done that, unpacked your research, but
That may have been a bit dull.
not at all, not at all. I think we would have captivated our audience completely. However, just as exciting, perhaps more exciting, is as we speak now, and I think by the time this episode has gone out, you will have released your new book, Empathic Leadership: Lessons from Elite Sport. So I'm guessing all the findings that you enjoyed during your research in your PhD are packed into this book, along with, I'm sure, a whole pile of anecdotes and experiential evidence. And I'd love to unpack this today. You've got 7 fantastic chapters related to empathic leadership.
Yeah.
So I suppose before we unpack this, I mean, boy, you've taken your PhD research and written a book pretty quickly there, Peter. It's impressive stuff.
Yeah, well, that remains to be seen after the reader can make their own decision. But one of the things that frustrates me about academia a little bit is the academic writing style, academic rules. There's a sort of obsession with writing academic papers and getting published as much as possible, but often the academic papers are things nobody wants to read just because of the way they're written. I was conscious that I didn't want to write an academic book. I wanted to write something for industry, for people to apply. I've always been passionate about subjects being applied in the real world. I think there's often a disconnect between what we learn in universities and what actually happens with that learning in the real world. And so when Routledge spoke to me about writing a book, I said, "Look, I don't want to write an academic book. Is that okay?" And they said, "Yeah, you can focus this on industry." And so I said, "I want to target at people who are in sport or who are coaching at any level, whether it's grassroots or at the very top, because I want to include the words, and I mean literally the words of my subjects." So what I tried to do to make the reading experience, to be empathic to the reader, if you like, is to write in an accessible style, using, where possible, the actual words of the coaches that I interviewed. So within the text, I've laced quotes from leaders to explain points by giving their own stories in their own words. Again, the academic style would have been to have these quotes as standalone pieces, and there's a disconnect in the reading experience then, I think. So I tried to lace it all in one in the text so that the reader's not disconnected from the overall narrative, and just did little things like use numbered reference systems so that there's not brackets of authors in the way of the reader as well, because I think if you're not used to that, that can be interruptive as well. So hopefully it's a good reading experience. Yeah.
So let's go through this because I'm keen to unpack this. So, firstly, define empathic leadership. for us, because this feels like a very new term. What is, for those coaches listening in, for all of us listening in, what is empathic leadership?
Right. If I can start with empathy. So,
Yeah, please.
just to give you a sort of basic definition of empathy, it can be defined in two different ways, really. There's emotional empathy, sometimes called affective
Okay.
empathy. That's where you
Yep.
share the feelings of another. So, if you
Okay.
see someone suffering, then you're actually feeling that suffering too. That's more common the closer you are to that individual. So,
Yep.
if it's your brother suffering, you're probably going to feel that more than if it's a stranger suffering. And the accuracy of that empathy is increased by that relationship. So the more you know that person and the greater that feeling, the more information that empathy is giving you about the condition, state, and perspective of the person suffering. And it might not be suffering; it might be somebody experiencing a magical moment, winning the lottery or something like that. You'll be able to more accurately feel how they're feeling by knowing them as an individual, as well as seeing the experience that they're going through. The other type of empathy is cognitive empathy. This is where we imagine ourselves into somebody else's world. There's a very important part of empathy that I think is missed by a lot of people. It is, we often talk about empathy walking in the shoes of somebody else, but it's very important to say that it's not about imagining ourselves in their shoes. It's about becoming them in the moment. Because if we imagine ourselves in the situation that somebody else is in, then if we were in that situation, we might act and feel very differently to how it makes them act or feel. So we have to use our knowledge of them to become them, to share the experience they're having rather than the one we'd have had if it had been us. So when we're using cognitive empathy, we're imagining ourselves into that world and that experience, and then try to understand the feelings, intentions, and perspective of that individual as themselves in that moment.
I think that's a really interesting definition, and quite robust definition. And I've got a few thoughts on that, actually. I mean, emotional empathy reminds me of the personality trait of agreeableness, which can be broken down, one trait being compassion. The emotional empathy piece feels like compassion. That might not be accurate. It's just what was going through my head as you were speaking there. And the cognitive empathy feels very much in line with, let's say, when you learn motivational interviewing. I mean, Professor Stephen Rolnick has been on the Sports Psych Show talking
Yeah,
about this. And, I think in motivational interviewing, they talk about empathy being a listening statement. It's listening to somebody, and as you said, you've almost built on this idea of being in somebody's shoes, but actually not just in their shoes, but in their body, and actually seeing the world through their lens, their cognitive lens, their
yeah,
affective lens. And it almost feels like that's where, as you were describing that, I was thinking about this as a skill, in as much as, does this require quite a bit of emotional intelligence? Does it require me to be
yeah.
able to actually tune in to somebody's lens, to pay attention to their lens of the world, their habits, their behaviors, perhaps guess at their thoughts, their feelings, in order to be accomplished at cognitive empathy?
Yeah. So there's a few things from what you've said there that just resonated. One of the things is when you talked about being in the body of somebody else, there's something called kinetic empathy, which is probably interesting and I think a little bit amusing as well. Is that when an empathic leader in sport gets in tune with somebody else and they're becoming that other person in the moment, and they watch their athlete on the field, you'll see kinetic empathy take place where their body actually performs the actions of the target of their empathy. So if you see a centre forward in football going for a header, you'll often see the coach on the touchline jumping up and trying to head the ball.
Yeah.
And that's kinetic empathy because they're becoming that athlete in the moment. Now, the other thing I was going to say about emotional empathy is one of the perceived problems with emotional empathy and being in tune with athletes, particularly in squads of athletes that have increased in size over the years, that if leaders are expected to have empathic relationships, closer relationships with their athletes, and be in tune with the feelings and perspectives of a lot of people, not just their squad, but the increased staff behind that, the multifaceted relationships that leaders have in sport with media, fans, rivals, national governing bodies, everything. All the relationships are important, and if they're acting empathically and being in tune with a number of people's feelings, the concern is that is this emotionally draining and does it encourage burnout and things like that? So that's where cognitive empathy, if you like, becomes a little bit of a more protective way of going about it, where you're using your cognitive imagination rather than your
Yeah.
emotional feelings.
Okay.
But then other people might say that the emotional or infective empathy
Mm-hmm.
is more accurate because you're actually really getting in touch with the experience because you're feeling the same thing. Now, when I interviewed head coaches, I spoke to them all about this, and nearly all of them gave me the same answer. They said that it's not draining because when you're sharing in the experiences of all these athletes, you're also sharing in the positive experiences they have. And
Okay.
usually, particularly if you're a good coach and things are going well, the positive experiences outnumber the negative experiences. And they were saying that it actually had more of a positive effect on them than a negative effect. And the positive effect of empathy is, scientifically been shown as well, is that when we empathize for somebody, or we perceive that they're empathizing for us, there's like a connection buzz that gives us a lift. Our oxytocin levels go up, our cortisol levels drop a little bit, so we feel less stressed and we feel a bit happier and safer in that position, in that relationship. Trust is increased. So we've only sort of just got into the tip of empathy at the moment, but you can already see that there are things that are going to be advantageous to a head coach in sport.
I think it's fascinating. And again, my mind is a buzz here. You're making me think of, I mean, geez, you studied at Loughborough University, your PhD, so I'm pretty certain you came across Professor Sophia Jarrett, and it's
Yeah,
making me think of her coach-athlete relationship model, 4Cs. You're making me think of the conversation I had on the Sports Night show with Lisa Feldman Barrett and the social brain,
mm.
how
Yeah. I've read her book on emotions. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, absolutely. Really in line with what you're saying, and but also, delving into the work of Dr. Dan Brown at Portsmouth University on flourishing and thriving. I was thinking about empathy being a platform for driving energizing environments, thriving,
yeah,
flourishing, and not just, oh, it's emotionally exhausting. That's really fascinating that you got that feedback from those leaders. Hey, look, let's dive into chapter one, self empathy. I think it's really interesting to me because I always say perhaps the least cool skills, if you like, in coaching might be self skills, self
mm.
awareness, self control, self reflection, self development. They're not the funkiest skills, but they possibly might be the most important. And it's interesting. Self empathy is your first chapter. This is chapter one. This sounds like it's quite important.
Yeah. I think it is. Yeah, I'm really sorry to go back on a point, but can I
Yeah.
just add to the positive um, physiological effects of empathy that we were just talking about? I think that's a major plus for any. You look at the investments that head coaches or sports clubs make in healing time. Empathy has been shown to help with increasing
Okay.
healing time. So you look at the things that big clubs buy, like oxygen and cold therapy machine rooms and things like that. When the type of people that they're recruiting and the atmosphere they've got can actually increase the healing time of a star player,
Mhm.
for example. Sorry to go back on that, but it's just something that came to me and I thought
No,
it was important.
thank goodness.
So the self empathy, I started with that because I think in any relationship, it's really important to examine yourself before you start to understand other people. Um, One of the biggest reasons for this that came across from the head coaches I spoke with is sometimes we feel the emotions of other people through empathy, or just like emotions are contagious. So we might start feeling things that a group is feeling in general, and we put them down as our own emotions. So I had an ice hockey head coach who, he was about to play a very big game, and the they'd been out. The athletes had been out on the ice. He felt really nervous. His fellow coaches felt really nervous, and they came back in and had a chat before they spoke to the athletes before the game and said, "Look, we think." He said, "I think they're nervous. I think there's something wrong. How can we calm them down?" And then, as the coaches talked amongst themselves, they realised that it was them that were nervous, not the athletes. And they spoke to one or two athletes, and they all felt really excited about the game. There were no nerves there. So just by understanding your own emotions in that moment, you then go into a pre-match talk with a completely different talk in mind to the one that you'd have had if you hadn't rationalised or understood your own emotional internal feelings.
That so resonates with me, Peter, because the number in my own consultancy practice, the number of changing rooms I've been in where maybe the coaches have made a remark after maybe the team have gone out onto the pitch to perform, and they said, "Oh, I'm not too sure they were feeling it today," or "Oh, wasn't that great?" And you do wonder, oh, is that your own inner experiences that are compelling you to think that way? And then the second thing it makes me think of is this phenomenon of emotional contagion.
Yeah,
If you experience something as a leader and then you respond accordingly, how that can then influence your behaviors to influence the players. So this idea of self empathy is surely very important in that situation.
yeah. So that response is a really important
Okay.
word, because when we feel an emotion, we feel like we want to respond straight away, don't we? And one of the important things about doing some work on self empathy is understanding that we don't want to just respond to the feeling. We have to rationalize that information that's come in. So we might be understanding that we feel angry, for example, and like anybody in the world, if we feel angry in a moment, we might feel like punching someone or hitting out or hitting a wall or something like that. But if we rationalize that feeling and think, right, is that going to be the best solution or the best way of reconciling that feeling or that issue or the problem at the time, and we understand that it's not, so we digest it and we take our time, and that's something that the head coaches I spoke with are very conscious of. That, for example, when a game's gone badly, for example, you've probably heard this 1,000 times, but coming back in the changing rooms after, it's probably not the best time for everyone to dissect it and to react, because they're talking with their emotions. People are going to sort of hit out verbally, if not physically, as Sadio Mane apparently did the other day. So often head coaches will say, we'll talk about this on Monday morning or something like
Yeah.
that. And it's the same if sometimes athletes have come to coaches I've spoken to and said, "I've decided I'm leaving. That's me. I'm going at the end of the season."
Mm.
And the head coach is often probably very invested in an athlete like that, and then feels very angry in the moment. But the response of anger in that moment is not going to serve them well. So the reaction is typically now, from a more empathic leader, I'd say, is to say, "Okay, let me have a think about this. We'll have a meeting tomorrow or the next day, and we'll discuss it, and we'll see, why you feel like that and how I think about it and stuff like that." So it's just sort of delaying it to give yourself the time to understand how you feel about it, rationalize those feelings, and consider things logically as well, and see where the best solution lies.
Be in tune with yourself, how you feel, what you're experiencing, and act accordingly. Act appropriately, act intelligently based on what you're experiencing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So whatever's best for that situation, rather than just reacting from the feeling. But it's important not to. It's important not to say the feelings, not to wipe away the feeling
No.
as not important. The feeling is important because the feeling is full of information,
Yes.
and you've got to use that information.
Yes.
That's the key.
Yes. Yes. The word coming through for me is being flexible. being
Yeah, yeah,
adaptable is knowing whether I'm going to use this feeling overtly or whether actually I'm going to slightly, for want probably of a better term, close off to this feeling and go in another direction. Obviously, in these situations as a leader, or most situations, you've got to be intelligent with yourself, as we're talking here about self-empathy. But so much of your role as a leader is to communicate with others, and that's what you speak about in chapter 2 is empathic communication. Can you talk to us a little bit about empathic communication and bring this alive for us?
sure, yeah. So there are many facets to empathic communication, but it's obviously focused on the experience of the one you're communicating with and appreciating, recognizing, understanding that experience. One of the goals of empathic communication is listening fidelity, if you like, so that this, when you speak to an athlete, they're understanding what you say in the same way that you understand what you've said. That the understanding is shared, and they don't take it to mean something else. Now, this is enhanced by the closer relationship you have with athletes. So all of the head coaches I've spoken to, and as I say, you've probably seen it as well, and we've all seen it on TV. And we'll probably go on to speak about relationships, but the relationship between head coaches in sport today and their athletes is far closer than it was
Yes.
20 years ago. So you see it just in cliched clips of Pep and Klopp hugging players after a game and joking around with players, and there's just a lot closer relationship there. So if you're closer to somebody and you understand them better, you understand how they're likely to hear something when you speak to them. But there's also little bits of things that came through from speaking to the head coaches, just little things like when you want to speak to an athlete to say, can I speak with you rather than can I speak to you? Because subconsciously there's just a sort of alarm bell goes off. Oh, he's going to talk to me. He's going to give me a talking to. You know, speak with me. It's a shared thing. And again, it's something that comes through in the culture of all the top leaders today is that they're there to help the team as part of the team rather than above it, directing things and sort of top down. It's that's something that's changed very much, I think. And different things that head coaches have to communicate to athletes are done in very different ways to what they were done a couple of decades ago. A lot of the coaches use the example of announcing team selection, for example, where one coach said to me that he had a coach himself when he was an athlete who used to stick the team up on the back of his door and then almost run to his car and drive home. And the other athletes had another coach said to me that everybody had a time that they had to ring in to speak to the head coach's secretary to find out whether they were in the team or not. So it was obviously something that was avoided, if possible, by a lot of coaches. Now to get that right, a lot of head coaches are discussing with players or athletes how they want to be informed about their selection. Do they want to be informed by an email? Do they want to be informed? Do the group prefer to be informed together? Does the individuals want to be spoken to face if the time allows it? Some athletes tell their head coaches that they'd like to be informed whether they're playing by an email or a message or something, and then have the opportunity to discuss it at a later date. So there's all sorts of individual perspectives on this, and obviously there's got to be a balance between what the coach can manage to cater for individually, but it's the fact that coaches are a lot more interested in the experience of athletes and how it affects them.
I love everything you're saying, and it's got me really thinking here. I mean, some of the things you said towards the end there, in terms of communicating with athletes, whether they're going to be in the team, that historical context of avoidance rather than approach. If we think about the brain working in those two
Mm.
basic directions, that actually now what is commonplace is we want leaders to approach relationships rather than avoid relationships, essentially. But there were two other things that I heard, I think, that are really important to capture, and they're very subtle things, I think. I mean, it's when you're having a conversation with somebody, it's not just to look at the world through your own lens. hey, we're talking about empathy, aren't we? But it's considering their experience of the conversation, isn't it? And that's, you got to think
Yeah,
about that one. You got to think about, that makes communication challenging, tough. But what experience are they having right now as I'm communicating with them? And the other subtle thing I loved about what you said there is, a subtlety of language, a nuance of language. Speak with somebody and not to somebody. I think coaches listening might say, "Oh, wow! I mean, that's a bit fussy here," but it's understanding that the brain works very quickly. I mean, again, coming back to Lisa Feldman Barrett, she will
yeah,
say, ambient neural activity. The brain is working in milliseconds. We're constantly judging what's going on around us. So,
that's right.
yeah, no question, but just a sort of some thoughts based on what you said there.
Yeah, so the other thing in those conversations that athletes have with coaches is obviously there's a massive important area of empathic communication is listening,
Mm,
but even more so when it comes to empathy is the perception of the athlete that they are being heard.
mm,
So and that communication is dynamic, so it's back and forth. It's not somebody talking to somebody else, it's somebody talking then somebody else listening, and the head coach not getting ready to win an argument or to slam home their point, but listening before and then rationalizing and understanding the perspective before they react.
mm.
And the power of that, when an athlete goes away thinking, he's just listened to me, or she's just heard what I said and understand how I feel. And that's massive for increasing their commitment to that leader.
Really interesting. Really interesting. Let's move on to the next chapter, empathic relationships. I mean, there's going to be a relationship here with communication, of course, but can you give us some insights as to what you've introduced the reader to in this chapter?
Yeah, so the difference between head coaches, say 20 years ago, and this is coming from what the head coaches told me about their experiences as athletes compared with what they experience today, is that the general culture of leadership, and not for all leaders, obviously, there were obviously, probably empathic examples of leadership in sport before the word was used as much as it is now. But the general style of leadership was it's my way or the highway. If you don't fit into the way we do things here, you're not going to get in the team.
Mm,
And one of the concerns that head coaches I spoke with said about that was that you're going to lose talent if you go about things that way. If you go about it that it's my way or the highway, then some people are going to think, I don't fit in with this guy. I don't have a relationship with him. I don't connect with him. I'm either going to disconnect and so I'm not going to
mm,
perform, or I'm going to try and leave. 20 years ago, or before the Bosman ruling, say, a bit longer ago maybe, in football, for example, the athletes maybe didn't have the power to leave in those situations. And so they they weren't lost to a club. They had to stay and sort of fight and play against the grain, if you like, just endure a relationship rather than enjoy one, when they wouldn't have been excelling and showing their talents as much as they would have done if they were in a comfortable relationship where they were seen for who they are, recognised for who they are, and there was a little bit more flexibility about the way they were coached. But now players can just leave. They'll find another club to go to. The commitment to a particular coach has to rely on the relationship now more than ever. The athlete has other things in their head. They have their own brand. They have their connection to their international team. They have their connection to the sport in general, to the fans, that they might be prioritising above their connection with a coach. So unless that relationship with the head coach is right, it's quite easy for an athlete to have their head turned. That they need to know that that's a strong relationship, that they trust the coach they're with, and that they feel the coach understands them, their perspective, their ambition, and the way they go about things in order to do them the best.
in this chapter, do you unpack that a little bit more for leaders? What things have they got to do? What specific things can they do? Can they look at striving to try in order to build, those kind of empathic relationships with players?
Yeah, so head coaches spoke to me a lot about understanding the person behind
Mm.
the athlete. So any opportunity to have conversations with athletes was important. One county cricket coach said that conversations on the team bus, for example, he'd try and work his way round through a season to make sure he'd sit with somebody else each time and discuss their lives, their world, their interest. And often something would crop up where they were both interested in films, you know, and then all of a sudden, bang, you've got a connection point where you might have conversations regularly about a film you've seen or about a filmmaker or something like that. So any little things that people have in common brings them closer together, and you can't find out about those things that you've got in common until you have these sorts of conversations, and they've got to be relaxed, not formal conversations, but just on maybe on the training ground while someone's juggling a ball, or on a bus or a plane, just conversations that on a human level to understand the other person. And it's also important that the athlete is recognised not just by the head coach, but by the wider environment for who they are. Again, a county cricket coach told me about a young player that they had who seemed to have a lot of inner confidence, but he was still very quiet within the squad. And the coach used to encourage lots of social events with the squad, going out together and things, doing different things. And it's when you do these different things that things suddenly appear from individuals. And they went to some sort of music event or concert or something. And the head coach didn't go himself, but the players all come in the change room the next day and said, "Oh, you should have seen this guy last night. I've never seen anything like it." And it turns out that this young player was a really good dancer. He trained to dance as well as his cricket. And everyone suddenly respected him for this talent that he had nothing to do with the game, but they saw him as, oh, he's the dancer. He's the guy that can move like unlike any of us. And that made him feel better because then he was recognised by the group he's in, but for who he is. He's not just somebody who has to come in and put a mask on. I'm a professional cricketer now. I'm a dancer who plays, or I'm a cricketer and I can dance as well. And this is more about my personality. So a lot of the head coaches were really encouraging of different events like that, or opportunities to show people who could play musical instruments, or just getting groups of people together to understand them better.
During that explanation, you use that word environment, and in the next chapter, you talk about empathic climates. In sports psychology, environment,
Yeah.
climate, they can kind of go hand in hand. We talk about in sports psychology a lot about mastery climates, for example, but empathic climates. Tell me a little bit about this. Obviously, everything we've spoken about so far, I'm sure, drives the climate, but unpack this a little bit for me here, Peter.
Yeah. So we often talk about, I think probably what gets the headlines when we talk about climates more than anything else is a toxic climate or a unsafe
Mhm.
climate in sport. And we've heard about several of those, right up at international level over the last few years, haven't we? And the aim is obviously a safe climate. And we
Mhm.
know that in a safe climate, performance is enhanced, creativity in particular is enhanced because people feel safe enough to try things and to suggest things. And, the whole group will profit from a safe climate. I think empathic climate is a little bit more than that, in that as well as the safety aspect, you feel genuinely recognised and cared for by the group.
Okay.
So it's about, again, understanding each other. It's about empathy spreading throughout the group. And an empathic leader will do that subconsciously anyway by setting an example and emotional contagion. Empathy is a contagious thing. But we'll probably go on one of the later chapters. I speak about developing empathy in teams and squads,
Mhm.
and that helps to enhance the sort of safety and care in the climate. If you know that your teammates really care about your performance and your experience of being a professional athlete, then that gives you another lift, doesn't it? It makes you feel part. it makes the group more cohesive. It makes you feel more aligned to the team and everything. It just makes you feel part of something rather than an individual turning up to perform.
Next chapter, you talk about the importance of having a person-centered focus. Person-centered is a bit of a buzz term, or has been for the last few years. I'd be interested to get your perspective on this. And as you've mentioned, your book is littered with stories from the interviews conducted with leaders. So, what have the leaders spoken to in terms of being person-centered focus?
Yeah, so I think this is something again that crosses all industries. I'm just trying to think of the name of the character in Howard's End. I remember from the sort of period of the Industrial Revolution where he says, I know the faces of my workers, but I don't know what's beneath them. And I think that's something that really resonates to this area. It's important. We've just been talking about the importance of knowing and recognizing individuals, but also it's been a bit of a, I think it became a bit of a cliche to say that the team comes before everything else, you know, or the club is more important than the player, the teams. But you can't have a successful team without recognizing and understanding the individuals within it. So that means making sure that each individual, as well as the things we've just spoken about being recognized and valued and seen and being able to be themselves, but that their wider lives are stable. It's not going to be a likely thing to happen that an athlete comes into work and works really well if things are going really wrong at home, if there's lots of problems in their personal life. And obviously, speaking to head coaches, I've had a wide variety of examples of problems that athletes have come to them with, from eating disorders, other psychological problems, relationship problems, divorce. All these life events happen to athletes. And it's important that head coaches know about these things, because then they might understand the reason for things going on. And sometimes head coaches have said that athletes have been almost worried about sharing that information because it might be a reason for the head coach not to select them. But it's important that the head coach reassures them that, look, I need to know what's going on. Maybe I can help. Maybe I can be somebody to talk to. Maybe I've got experiences of my own that I can share. And that's a very powerful thing. If a head coach is willing to share personal stories and information with an athlete, that enhances trust and brings the relationship tighter together, as well as helping the individual in that moment. But maybe reassuring them that I'm not going to sort of take you out the team for this, but I just need to understand how you're feeling, and we'll see how things go. And if it becomes a bigger problem over a longer term, then maybe we'll talk about it. But to be able to know exactly what's going on in the wider lives of individuals and seeing them as individuals and not just athletes who you see turn up at 9 o'clock each day and then you forget about the rest of their lives once they've gone home.
As a sports psychologist, Peter, I tend to get a lot of questions, or maybe even a bit of skepticism thrown at me by coaches from time to time around really what you're speaking to. That, some coaches will say, well, I can never foresee a situation where a player will come and confide in me, for example, irrespective of how comfortable I make them feel. Now, my response, I have multiple responses, but one response is, well, if you normalize some of the things you're speaking to in this environment, then you might be surprised. It's not to suggest that every single player is definitely going to come and confide in you with regard to their specific challenges, but you might find that more do open up and feel, by creating that safer environment, that you do give them the opportunity to confide, talk about their challenges, even in the face of some concern about losing their position in the team. You kind of turn down the volume of that concern, that worry, that doubt. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's not only about the player involved. Once these things will snowball, because if somebody's had a problem and they've gone to their head coach about that problem, and the head coach has done as I just said, shared an example from their own life, and they've sort of connected and discussed it, and he's offered some support to them, and then that athlete will then go away, and if they see another athlete struggling with something, they're more likely to say, look, you should go and see the coach because I had this issue a little while ago and he was so good about it. He was so, helpful and understanding. And then that encourages other athletes to go. And as you know, head coaches are examined by athletes the whole time. They don't just notice how they're dealing with them, they notice how they're dealing with their peers as well. And if you have other athletes also reinforcing that by saying, look, you should go and speak to him about that, because I've spoken to him about it before. He hasn't, reacted in a negative way. He's been nothing but supportive. It's helped me. So, yeah, I think that was something that came across in my research as well.
What you're speaking to there feels like a neat segue to the next chapter of empathic accuracy. I feel I can take a guess as to what this is about, but enlighten us. Tell us about empathic accuracy.
Right. So there are various things that head coaches can use empathy for. When I talk about empathic accuracy, what I mean is I'm talking about all the information that they can use to understand the perspectives and intentions of that individual better. So when you know someone well, you pick up on what we call impression cues, just slight little nuances of behaviour, body language, things like that. So we might see. I've just had an image of Chris Waddle come into my head.
Oh, you might have to explain who Chris Waddle is for some.
So he was a winger that played for England and Tottenham and Newcastle, and he used to play with a bit of a sort of a bit of a stoop or a bit of a hunchback, and it may not have looked like he was that happy or energetic. But if you saw his performances, he was a fantastic footballer. But you'd have to know the individual to know that his body language, the way he played, didn't mean what it might mean for other people.
Yeah.
So when we see body language, it's uniquely appropriate for that individual. A player who looks tired on a pitch might not be tired. It might be just their style of running. A player that looks like they've lost it in their head might not have lost it. You might know them well enough to know that they're doing that for a reason, to get the team up, and they're very calm in their head. It's about understanding individuals and to be able to accurately understand the state that they're in that moment. And the things that head coaches can do with the information, if they can empathise accurately, is it gives you an idea of not only what the player is going to do in a specific situation, which will help you probably with team selection or substitutions or choice of penalty takers or something like that. It can also help you with understanding the potential. If you know the person inside out, you understand where you think they can go by using that information. So not just the potential in a moment or a situation, but the potential for their career, which will then help you with recruitment, with whether to retain players or move them on. It helps with all sorts of things. But one of the most interesting areas, I think, is most of the stuff we've been talking about is about understanding athletes. And obviously that's like paramount to head coaching sport. But I'm really interested in using empathy to understand the opposition. So, and it works the same. The more you understand, if we take, for example, the opposition head coach. Now, obviously, a lot of coaches know each other. Some know each other better than others will know each other. But the more you understand that other head coach, the more accurately you can empathise with them in situations. It might be pre-game, it might be during a game. I came up with a little formula just the other day. I was thinking, like, knowledge of rival plus empathy equals knowledge of likely intentions. Now that's not going to be a perfect solution every time, but it gives you a possible edge over understanding or being able to predict the strategy of your opponent. And there's not many things that can do that.
Yeah, as you're speaking now, I almost think of this mini equation: insights drives prediction. You know, if I'm being if
Yeah,
I
yeah,
can build those insights as to opposition, the opposition coach's behaviours, the mini habits that might betray their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, those insights can potentially drive, will drive a prediction, and subsequently I can make some choices and make decisions, in part maybe based on what I've seen. It can broaden my
yeah.
options, technically, tactically.
That's right. Yeah. I once heard Sir Mike Brearley, the
Okay.
England cricket captain, talk. He's a psychoanalyst as well now. He gave a talk about empathy and understanding opposition and rivals and things like that. And he talked about some Kalahari Bushmen who, to learn to hunt better, one of the Bushmen would dress up as the animal they were hunting and try to become that animal and run where they thought that animal would run to for safety, so that the Bushmen knew what was likely to happen in the real event. So it, he, Mike Briley speaks about it's not only important to not understand how we tick; it's about understanding how the opposition ticks.
Interesting, interesting. Directing attention on the opposition as much as we direct our attention onto us. Hey, look, you finish your book, a final chapter, which you mentioned earlier, developing empathy. It'd be fantastic to close this conversation by giving us all a few ideas on developing empathy. You've given us some brilliant ideas and some insights from your book already. Give us some thoughts on developing empathy.
Okay, so when I spoke to the head coaches when I interviewed them, this was a question I think they paused about the most, because I think they had to think about what they were actually doing and whether that was developing
Mm,
empathy. And I think they came up with some great answers. So one of the things that you've probably been experienced in and seen many times is to bring a group closer together. They often do things like get athletes to share stories, like biographical stories of where they've come from, how hard they've had to make it, or whatever, what their childhood background was like, their family background, their with sport being so multinational now, we've got people coming from different cultures all around the world, and by sharing biographical stories, the other athletes then get a greater understanding and can empathise more with the rest of their lives and their performances on the pitch and everything. So it brings the group closer together, and this empathy acts like a glue.
mm,
And these stories enhance that. I was reminded of this actually when I saw Virgil van Dijk interviewed the other day, the Liverpool
yeah.
player, and I don't know why, but the reporter had got some information about. I've heard you had things quite hard when you were growing up. You were a dishwasher for many years as a youth and stuff like that. And Virgil van Dijk's response was that, yeah, I've never really seen it as a hardship, but I definitely didn't after I heard Sadio Mane's life story growing up in Senegal. So that had clearly had an impact on him hearing
Mm,
that. And when he sees the hunger that someone like that has on the pitch, he's probably understanding of it more, and he can understand and predict behaviour better. But when a group understand each other better, they can use their empathy to tailor the way they communicate with each other.
mm,
It's a bit of a cliche, but some people want to kick up the backside and some people want an arm around them, and people will react differently to instructions on the field depending on how they're delivered. So you can decide how you communicate with one another. You can understand why they might be reacting in a certain way if you know more about them. It just brings greater understanding to a group, and I think that makes a group more cohesive, more aligned, more together for the fight. And I think developing empathy, that's one of the ways that, just anything that gets groups talking to each other about things that are not to do with the game. Probably, I know a lot of groups use conversation cubes and things like that just to get any subject to come up, to get a conversation in the group that will help you learn about how people might be likely to react in certain
mm,
situations.
mm.
One of the best ways, obviously, uh, and a empathic head coach can spread empathy through the team is by considering empathy when they think of their on the field leaders, and they're choosing which people they think want to be captain and things like that. And I think there's a great example. Obviously, it was probably not a difficult decision to make Lionel Messi captain of his country, but there was a great example at the World Cup of a captain showing empathy, I think. So before the World Cup, if you look at the Brighton footballer Alexis McAllister, he wasn't in the first team for Argentina. Argentina had the catastrophe of losing to Saudi Arabia, and it all looked a bit dark for them. And I think a lot of people in the rest of the world wanted to see Messi win the World Cup as well, and were starting to worry. And then you have McAllister come into the team and play well against Poland, scoring. I think it was against Poland, then scoring the next game. And he eventually ends up setting up one of the goals in the final, and he's one of the first names on the team sheet when they pick that team for the final. And then you look into the background of that journey he's had from coming into the team, and I saw an interview with him where he explained that he wasn't feeling very confident, and the rest of the players called him Colo because he has ginger hair, and that's what you call people in Argentina if they've got red hair. And Messi had seen this, and you might think that, I don't know, maybe the ego might have got the better of him at a World Cup that he was meant to win, and it was the end of his career, and he'd be thinking solely about how he was going to win the World Cup. But he noticed that this nickname had taken hold amongst the squad, and he approached McAllister and said, "I've heard them call you Colo. Do you like this?" And McAllister said, "Well, no, I don't." You can tell if you've seen him interviewed. He seems like quite a shy guy and not someone probably to say something himself. But Messi noticed that he didn't like it. And so he said he told Messi he didn't like it. Messi's gone back to the rest of the squad, and obviously Messi's words are quite powerful with the rest of the squad. He's never called Colo again, and then he has that run in the team, and possibly, Argentina wouldn't have won the World Cup without that. So that's an example of an empathic approach to captaincy, I think, that, is fairly unbeatable. It meant winning a World Cup.
Fantastic story, Peter. Really highlights and illustrates the importance of empathy. A small nudge there that, as you're saying, maybe made a big difference to outcome. And just to speak to something you said earlier about players getting to know each other, Virgil van Dijk getting to know and understand Sadio Mane's biography, his story. I was involved with a Premier League club for a bit, that every Friday they got together and they shared those kind of stories. They did it in a specific way, and there was more to it, and there was a bit more entertainment to it, but it gave people and staff as well the platform to talk about the great things that have happened in their life, the challenges that they've experienced, and so on and so forth. So there's so many things that coaches can do. And not everybody has the same time and resources. We're talking to the very highest level there, but there are things that coaches can absolutely do, that they can build even into a wet Wednesday evening for a couple of minutes at the beginning of training.
Yeah.
Look, Peter, what an absolutely fantastic conversation this has been, and I've dived into the book already and have really enjoyed the stories, the interviews, all of which are evidence grounded as well from a theoretical perspective. So it's a wonderful book that I would recommend everybody who's listening in to get. Let's finish things off here by give us an idea of how people can find you, how can they follow you on social media, and how, most importantly, can they find this book and purchase it.
Yeah, sure. So the book's available from all booksellers, so it's all the usual places. It's also available on the Routledge website.
Okay.
You can find me and all my social media links and everything at empathicminds.org. So it's empathicminds.org. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, so anybody can message me there if they've got any questions about empathy in sport or anything. It'd be great to hear from anyone. And it'll just be wonderful. The more people who read the book, the better. Because I think empathy does not only improve performance and well-being for everybody, but just makes the world a better place and a more enjoyable work sort of situation for everybody.
Peter, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Social Show. If you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.